As I introduce our first Master Talk speaker, I want to start by saying it's a really special opportunity for me to introduce him because he is a good friend and he's a leader that I greatly admire. Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper was the first geologist ever elected governor. He was only the second brewer in our country after Sam Adams to be elected governor. Former mayor of the city of Denver. Of course, those are all great facts and lend to his very charismatic personality. But what's most important here is his impact. As governor and as mayor, this is an individual that has valued people and he has valued place. He is a convener, he is a collaborator, he's an inspiration, and he believes in the power of democracy, the power of vision, and the power of bringing people together to make things happen. Please welcome my friend, our leader of Colorado, Governor John Hickenlooper.
So thank you, Tammy, and just, I suspect most of you have had enough exchange with Tammy to realize what an amazing person she is. And everything I say, talking about Denver and Colorado, she's had her fingerprints on a large part of it. I also want to recognize David Downey and thank him for leading IDA. You guys are the futurists. You are the ones, and obviously to look in the future, you have to understand history. But you're the ones that are actually creating the cities and the metropolitan areas of the future, and it's only humans that create cities, right? And the only way we do that is by coming together and actually collaborating and getting towards that mythical point of what I always think of as unity. I interviewed a friend of mine's daughter wanted to go to the same college I went to, and she had dropped off of, she was a great student, and she dropped off of student council the year in her sophomore year. She was about to become president of her class and joined the booster club. I said, what, trying to get into a good school, why would you do that? And she looked at me and she said, Governor, the student council was negotiating discipline with the teachers and parking spaces, and what we need is unity. And she described how she started playing on a lacrosse team when she was 6 years old. So for 11 years, she played with the same group of girls. They dreamed the same dreams. When they were on the field, it was the most exhilarating experience that she could have. And they came together with a force of unity. And she says unity matters over almost everything. And our school didn't have unity. And all the booster club was just doing the homecoming. I wanted to go out and work on recycling and sustainability issues and bring students together in all different ways and move the school closer to unity. And in a funny way, that's part of what you all are doing is creating unity. I first came to Colorado as a young geologist, as Tammy said, and during the long recession in the 1980s, our company got sold. Like tens of thousands of geologists, I got laid off. Our whole company got laid off. And let me just tell you, by the way, back then it's not so different than it is today. I was out of work for almost 2 years. And the unemployment services of the federal government, they basically sent me to a 1-hour seminar on how to write a resume and gave me an office with a phone and a free long-distance telephone and a Xerox machine. And I was out of work for, as I said, almost 2 years. After about 8 or 10 months, you see a different person in the mirror than you're used to seeing. And I looked at that process, and in the end, I wasn't going to find a job. So with a couple friends, we started the first brew pub in the Rocky Mountains, a restaurant that brews its own beer. That's how I got to be the first brewer governor since Sam Adams. In 1792, I don't mind pointing out. And we went and we picked a part of Denver called Lower Downtown. And at that point, it was so abandoned. The rent was $1 a square foot per year. And that's a reflection of how bad it was down there. The market couldn't have been worse. But the Downtown Denver Partnership had created a thing called the Lower Downtown Support Office because they saw this assemblage of historic buildings as a place of great potential and a place where you could build unity. And so I went to work with my friends. It took us 2 years to raise the money. And this is so pathetic, but we were only trying to raise $575,000. We did everything by ourselves. I couldn't get my own mother to invest. But after, we finally got open in October of 1988, and after a few years of, 70 hours a week, pushing as hard as we could, it began to start taking off, and we went and did brew pubs in other cities. We did one in Fort Collins and one in Colorado Springs, and then we went out to Omaha and Des Moines, Rapid City, South Dakota, Green Bay, Wisconsin, Wheeling, West Virginia, some of the big cities like San Francisco, but really focused on smaller communities that had abandoned downtowns, historic buildings always, each one had a different name, and we tried to find at least half the investors locally to try and build community. And they didn't all work perfectly, but we did see, most of them are still in business, and if you go to Rapid City, it's the Firehouse Brewing Company right on Main Street. But we got to see firsthand how people come together in downtowns. I walked over 100 downtowns. And so these were all in the United States, but I don't think it's that different because I spent a lot of time in Latin America, a lot of time in Canada. We looked at a number of cities in Canada. And that collaboration that comes, that brings people together who care about a place, moves you towards that sense of unity. And after we opened, I think we'd opened about 16 brew pubs, and I kind of got sick of traveling so much. And so I was the one, our customers would complain about every elected official. That guy's a bum, that city council member, that congressional representative. And I kept saying, but this is America. They are us. If you don't like it, you should run. And somehow they twisted that on me. And in 2003, and you have to understand, I grew up with the equivalent of the bottom of Coke bottles in plastic frames as my glasses. I was skinny. I was dyslexic, so I wasn't a very good student. So I never ran for student council. I didn't hang out with the people who did. I don't want to offend anybody here. But I ran for mayor of Denver, which is a strong mayor city. The mayor makes the budget, appoints everybody. City council needs 9 out of 13 votes to change one line item of his budget. It's a great system. And I went on the principle, I went to, at that time, my predecessor, Wellington Webb, who was a great mayor, one of the great big city mayors in America at that time, in the second half of the 20th century. But he was at war with the suburbs all the time. And so I went to him and really focused on how can I repair the damage? He said, well, it's impossible. The suburbs hate the city hates the suburbs. Always been that way. And then I started going to the suburban mayors and just listening and asking them questions. I went to about almost a dozen. There were at that time 34 mayors in the metro area, and heard the same thing again, that Denver was just in it for themselves. And so I ran on a public campaign. I came out and said, if I get elected, I realized there will never be a great city without great suburbs, and if I get elected, I'm going to do everything I can to make the suburbs more successful. And Denver had senior water rights, crucially important in the West. We're going to share our water. We're going to do all these things. And the political strategist said, you don't have a prayer. Oh, I also made a commitment I'd never do a negative ad. They said, you're toast. The bottom line was I won. I got 65% of the vote running. Originally there were 4 lifetime talented politicians in that campaign. And we did start sharing water when I got elected, and they said, you do that, you'll never get reelected. We went out and worked with all the suburban mayors. We got all 34 mayors, so 2/3 were either Republicans or conservative-leaning independents. We got all 34 mayors to unanimously support fast tracks, which was 122 miles of new track. More importantly, yeah, there you go, clap for fast tracks. And more importantly, it was a 0.4% sales tax increase that, again, 34 mayors unanimously supported. It passed with 55%. And that has been, that was the foundation by which we began working with all those suburban mayors. When I ran for governor, and it's funny, I learned when I was in the restaurant business that the best way to persuade anyone, well, actually I can say I don't think I've ever persuaded anyone to change their mind about something that's important by telling them why I was right and they were wrong. The only way you can do it is to listen, keep asking questions. If you listen hard enough, they will feel validated, and this is another restaurant trick. use their own words back to them. It's amazing how that calms people down when they get agitated, especially if they've got hot soup in their lap. But that process of really listening opens up them to hearing a different reality. And funny, like magic, you change your perspective and suddenly you begin to get compromised. You begin to get towards that magic little bit of trust. And I think when I ran for governor, I said the same thing. I said, from now on, it's not just going to be the urban cities along the Front Range and everything helps them. We're going to do everything we can to make sure we lift up the whole state. And we went to every county, 64 counties in Colorado, made that pledge. I made the commitment in the campaign, and we called it the Bottom-Up Economic Development Plan. But it's funny, even the smallest towns have the equivalent of a downtown association. And I'm talking about Colorado, but this, I think, applies to the country. I think it applies to this hemisphere, and I think it applies to the world. There's always that group of people that have an affection for and a love of a place. You know, there's a word for it. I don't want to scare anyone off, but topophilia, that's the word that means love of place. And I think it's the key to 95% of all sustainable economic development. People have that affection, and that's a large part of how you create unity and how bring people together. And I think that we saw that as I went around the state. People said, get rid of red tape, less bureaucracy, have the state be more pro-business, but with the highest ethical standards, the highest environmental standards. And we were able to, in the end, I started, Colorado was 40th in job creation when I first ran. For the last 2 years, we've been the #1 economy in the country. And a lot of that is just getting people to all work together with the same vision, that unity of purpose, which again is what I think pretty much everyone in this room works on every day. And we took on some of the most divisive conflicts that there are. We went to the oil and gas industry and said that, you know, Colorado is one of the top 5 states in oil and gas production. And we said, fugitive emissions, methane escaping from these oil fields and pipelines, is 60 times worse than CO2 in terms of climate change. And you need to fix this. And I said that to one of the CEOs, and he says, well, if we do that, first you're going to create a mountain of red tape, then you're going to make us spend all this money that really doesn't do any good, and then in the end, the environmental community will get all the credit. And so I went to the environmental community, the Environmental Defense Fund, NRDC, the Colorado Environmental Coalition, and said, I think the industry is ready to come to the table, but these 3 things they're worried about. And it took a little bit of work to convince everyone to the ground rules, but then we spent 14 months. It's sort of like working with the Hatfields and the McCoys. I mean, they just don't trust each other. They have a history of all these problems. Several times one side or the other would threaten to walk out of the room. But in the end, we passed our methane regulations. The oil and gas industry agreed to spend $60 million a year. It's the equivalent of removing 320,000 automobiles every year from our roads. And was everybody perfectly happy with it? No. But we spent the time to create that level of trust whereby people were willing to open up and try something new and consider something new. And I think once you get to that trust, that is, again, the essence of true long-term economic development and placemaking, which all of you are involved in. And I think the trust, what we brag on now, we stole it from, I can't remember who we stole it from. There's a guy named Jack Dangermond who runs a company called Esri, does databases. You should all know Esri if you don't. Anyway, he said, you guys are collaborating at the speed of trust. And that's exactly right. That's what we are doing. And I think when you build those collaborations, that's how you begin to get to unity. And the closer you can get to unity, unity is this mythical vision in the future. It's the gated city in the distance. You never actually get there, but you can get pretty darn close, as we have in a number of these places. And I think one of the great challenges we have, not just in the United States today, but in the world, is people are getting so marginalized in their opinions and so frustrated by the discourse. You see nationalism and extreme forms of nationalism in almost every part of the world. And as that happens, that makes it harder and harder to get unity and a shared vision of purpose, which is how literally every city ever built is created and how they'll ever grow. You all know that this regional approach to cities is the future. I know Tammy Dorr with the Denver Partnership has gone out of her way to reach out not just to the metro Denver area to make sure the suburbs continue to, that prosperity is shared between both the cities and the suburbs, but she's reached out to the rest of the state. And that overall sense, that whole idea of unity and a rising tide is going to create greater benefits, not just for the whole state, but for the center city as well. I say sometimes, whenever it gets tough, I tell this story. This is when I was running for mayor. I think I was at 4% in the polls, and I had all these young volunteers, and they kept saying, "You're not moving in the polls. What's going to happen?" I said, "I don't know, but we got to stay focused, we got to stay together, and we got to push." And so I had this little clipping that I carried in my wallet from a Denver Post story about a professor of public speaking at the University of Wyoming, up in Laramie, Wyoming. And she was talking about the importance of using opposites. And she said, if you talked about the worst times, talk about the best of times. If you talk about the agony, talk about the ecstasy. Words gain power by opposites being in the same sentence. She said, what's the opposite of despair? Kid raises her hand and goes, joy? She goes, exactly. You want to create emotional impact, use despair in the same sentence with joy. Then she looked around and she said, what's the opposite of woe? And a kid way in the back goes, giddy up! And it's hard to find a good political joke. And the opposite of woe isn't, in every case, it's not to work harder. It's not to push yourself. But in almost every case it is. And certainly in that campaign we pushed ourselves when we were with the oil and gas industry trying to get them together. A lot of times we had to push a little harder. Certainly working with all the suburban mayors, and there was that history of animosity and distrust. I mean, it's funny, I'm the first Denver mayor to be elected governor in 140 years. I mean, think about how unlikely that is, except for that history of mistrust and the lack of people to push a little harder. So as you guys go back to your cities in the United States and Canada, all over, I know you come from all over the world. Remember, as things get tough, giddy up. Thank you very much.